Okay, we'll get started here. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Cooper. I am the lead of the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University, and we are so pleased to host the 2018-2019 Learning Exchange Series for the Forest Climate Working Group. The Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for almost 10 years to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. We have currently been in the process of reinvigorating our focus and activities, and we welcome inquiries into our work. So please reach out if you have any questions or you think your organization might be interested in joining or learning more. Here we have the full lineup of speakers in the series, and you can see where we're making our way through some of our presentations. We do have the full lineup available on our website, and you can go ahead and register for any of them, of the talks that are of interest to you for the rest of the season, and you'll receive calendar invites. So it's a nice way to get a reminder and get it on your calendar now. I will note that our next speaker, our next session will be February 6th, and will feature George Berghorn, Assistant Professor of Construction Management here at Michigan State University, and Elaine O'Neill, the Director of Science and Sustainability at Quorum. And they'll present on getting forest management and land use carbon accounting right for harvested wood products. And again, you can register at our website for this session, but if you've gotten any email correspondences from us, you'll probably get an invite as well. And so for today's session, we are very pleased to introduce Dylan Jenkins, the VP of Portfolio Development at Finite Carbon. He'll be presenting Forest Carbon Offsets, a Viable Opportunity for Landowners. Dylan will provide an overview of the current status and trends for the United States and forest jurisdictions to offset, using offsets to price and curb greenhouse gas emissions, and the role of US forest landowners are playing in these markets. And before we get started with the presentation, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items and a number of frequently asked questions. If you'd like to be on our mailing list, please contact forestc@msu.edu, and you'll get announcements regarding these series and other interesting items. If you are affiliated with SAF and you are interested in receiving a CFE credit, you are qualified to earn 1 CFE for today's session. If you are registered, your name will automatically be added, but you're welcome to reach out to us at forestc@msu.edu if you have any questions about that. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the web on our website, along with any supplemental materials that are referenced, and we do include the presentation slides, and these will be up in just a number of days. And if you've registered, you will receive a follow-up email letting you know where to find that link, but you can also Google Forest Carbon and Climate Program. For Q&A today, we typically follow this session. We usually reserve questions for the end, but today we have one speaker, and so we may take a question break or two, but as usual, you're welcome to submit your questions as the speaker's talking. We invite you to use the chat button on your little Zoom interface bar, and there's a little drop-down triangle next to it. And here you can offer up questions at any point, and we'll compile some, but if there's some really pertinent questions, we'll go ahead and jump in and address those questions right then. If you are calling in by phone, but you have access to email, you can also send your questions by email to forestc@msu.edu. And I don't anticipate this being an issue today, but in case we have outstanding questions that we don't have time to answer, we will just work with our speaker and compile these into a Word document and post them along with the presentation materials. And so with that, I think we can hand it over. Dylan, would you please share your screen and begin your presentation?
All right, great. Does it look like you can see it?
Yep, looks great.
All right, fantastic. Well, happy New Year, folks. Thanks for taking time out of your day to listen to this presentation on forest carbon. For some of you have seen me present before, and some of this may be familiar, but it has been updated. There's a lot happening in the compliance and voluntary carbon offset space right now. So this is a space that's always in transition, but right now there's quite a bit going on. So while the primary focus of today's talk will be on the compliance offset space, because of the audience and because of some things that are going on right now, I will do my best to highlight some of the things that are going on jurisdictionally in the U.S. with regard to carbon pricing and also in the voluntary space. So we're going to cover some of that first, talk about who is doing carbon offset projects in the U.S., go through some of the mechanics of developing a forest carbon offset project, again, with primary focus on the compliance space, and then wrap it up with a bit of a forecast, just to kind of pull it together and see what the next year or two holds for forest carbon offsets. So just diving in with a little bit of background. So the U.S. is a major global emitter of greenhouse gases. This is from 2015 from the Energy Information Administration. They'll have a new report coming out later this month. But you'll see that Texas, California, and my home state of Pennsylvania are the big three emitters. Florida, Illinois, Louisiana, Ohio, close behind. Without going into too much detail about the history, as you know, the U.S. does not have a federal approach, nor does it look like we're going to have one anytime soon to pricing carbon emissions or putting a price on carbon. So in the absence of that, states have taken it upon themselves to move ahead and create their own solutions. And those solutions are pretty varied, but notably California, starting in 2006, and then right afterwards, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, nine New England states, with a few that have dropped out and come in again, are really the leaders in the United States as far as putting a price on carbon, and have relevance therefore potentially for forest landowners and their participation in those programs. So with that, we'll dive into to California's experience, and they are at least at the time now they've been making some significant progress in reducing their carbon emissions as intended, but it wasn't that long ago that they represented that state, which is the sixth largest economy in the world, if they were their own country, represented about 2% of the globe's greenhouse gases. Now, I think because of China's rise in emissions and India and the U.S., a report just came out yesterday that last year, our emissions increased by about 3.5%. California is coming down, but they still represent about 1.5%, I believe, of global greenhouse gas emissions. So in 2006, interestingly, under a Republican administration, they decided to cap their greenhouse gases and to cut their greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. Now, in July of 2017, they doubled down or recommitted and moved to reduce their emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So what that means is that there are about 600 facilities. Anybody who emits over 25,000 metric tons CO2 equivalent per year now has an emissions obligation in California to report and basically pay a fee for every ton of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas that they emit. And we'll go through the mechanics about how all that works here in a minute, but two important terms or concepts when you're talking about cap and trade are allowances and offsets. So their unit of trade is the same. They both represent 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. The big difference between an allowance and an offset, they're both issued by the sovereign, in this case by the state of California. But allowances are literally they're a permit to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide or their equivalent. An offset represents a voluntary action by somebody that's outside of the cap. And that voluntary action represents either a ton from not being emitted to the atmosphere to begin with, or being sequestered from the atmosphere. So the unit of the trade is the same, but the mechanics of those two things are a bit different. And just to show how all that works together, sorry, I threw another slide in here that you don't usually have, but just to show California's greenhouse gas emissions by type. Most emissions are CO2, and so it's not just carbon dioxide emissions, but also looking at methane and nitrous oxide and high global warming potential gases such as fluorocarbons that are included in this program. And then just to show the emissions by sector, and this changes from state to state, but this is a pretty typical pie chart. Looking at the majority coming from transportation, and then a big portion from industrial and electricity, both in-state production and out-of-state importing, which creates some interesting policy issues for folks that price carbon, agriculture, residential, and commercial. But looking at how the California offset market works, and how these pieces that I just mentioned about the emitters and the allowances and the offsets all come together. So in California, there are about 600 regulated facilities, or 350 companies plus or minus, that have these emissions of over 25,000 tons per year. And each of these companies has 3 mitigation options. The first one is to install better technologies with the stack. But these clean technologies right now are pretty expensive. The good news is that the whole point of having cap and trade and an offset program is ultimately to reduce and eliminate emissions, and to spur innovation and technology, and drive down these costs of clean tech. So, on a per metric ton of CO2 equivalent basis, right now, clean tech costs about $500 to $120 per ton to install, but that price is coming down because there's now a price on carbon, and anybody who's retrofitting a facility or building a new plant is now pricing in carbon if they're doing that in the state of California. So that price is coming down, but it's pretty expensive on a per ton basis. Now, what California decided to do by doing a cap and trade program is that they have an allowance program. So for every ton of emissions that a facility has that they have not eliminated through installing clean tech, they now can go, or have to go out to an auction that happens quarterly, or to a secondary market to buy these allowances, again, which is a permit to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Now, it's important to know that at least in California, they learned important lessons from RGGI and from the European trading scheme, that they needed to put a floor on this allowance price, and that floor goes up at 5% plus inflation, or CPI, per year. This year in 2019, there's a floor price for California carbon allowances of $15.62. And historically, those allowances have traded at that floor, but now they're starting to trade slightly above. So you'll see why that's important. That comes into play in a bit. Next is this animal called the offset. And remember that an offset is a voluntary action by somebody that's outside the cap that results in that action results in the reduction of emissions to the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Those offsets do not have a floor price, at least California. They typically trade at a risk-adjusted discount to the allowance price of about 15 to 25%. Currently, offsets are in short demand, short supply. And so we've seen prices, upwards of $14, getting very close to that allowance floor. But especially with forest offsets, because they're based on a dynamic system, And there's unique risks to carbon reversals, such as unintended wildfire insects, pest disease pathogens, whatnot. These offsets trade at a risk-adjusted discount to that allowance price. But they're pretty close. Now, if you see in the bottom left-hand corner, that emitters may not use offsets for their full obligations. As a matter of fact, up until 2020, they can only use offsets for up to 8% of their emissions obligations. So the other 92% has to come from the use of allowances. Now, interestingly, last year, and this, again, we'll get to this closer to the end of the presentation, but when California reauthorized their offset program to go to 2030 for a second program period, they reduced the allowed use of offsets in their program from 8% down to 4%, 2021 through 2025, and then going back up to 6%. The reason that you see 2 + 2 and 3 + 3, because there's another big caveat, and this was the introduction of a concept called direct environmental benefits. So direct environmental benefits that definition was used in the reauthorization language, but it wasn't very well defined. And what it means is that at least half of the offsets that are now used for the second program period, 2021 through 2030, have to have direct environmental benefits to the state of California. A very conservative reading of that definition or interpretation would mean that those offset projects have to occur within the geopolitical boundary of California. But everybody in the industry is aligning to try and make an argument that definition should be expanded to include waters that flow into the state of California, such as the Colorado River watershed, which supplies about 70% of Southern California's drinking water. Potentially the Columbia River watershed, which of course includes all the salmon spawning grounds. A reasonable definition that expands the geography beyond just the state of California. But regardless, this definition or this introduction to this concept of direct environmental benefits has massive implications for the way that this market is going to function. Moving from today onward, and again, we'll unpack that here in a bit. But this is how this whole system works together. So an offset from a buyer's perspective, it's a cost reduction mechanism. It's a way to meet their obligation, their emissions obligation, using offsets to reduce their costs of meeting that obligation. But again, they're very constrained on the number of offsets that they can use. From a landowner's perspective, it's really more like, it's kind of like a timber supply agreement. And again, we'll see this in a moment, but the landowner is making a commitment to maintain a certain level of carbon stocking in their trees on their land for a long period of time. So that's kind of the two ways conceptually to think about offsets from a demand, supply, or buyer and landowner perspective. The question that we often get, and again, this is just sort of a nod to the policy, is it's cap and trade reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this was published in 2016. I haven't seen an update to this graph, but it shows pretty clearly that from the time that the California's cap and trade program has been put in place, that both on a per capita and economy-wide scale, that greenhouse gas emissions are being reduced dramatically, but the state product is increasing. So there has not been a negative impact economically, at least at the California state level, of implementing this program. And yeah, again, there are a lot of folks that might debate or want to parse this graph out, but at a high level, this is what is happening here, and that's also with increasing population. So just taking a breath there, that's kind of the policy background. I'll stop for a second just to see if there's any questions, and then I want to go into the who's doing carbon projects. So Lauren, is there any question or two that you want to pose now, or you want me to just jump into the next section?
It doesn't look like we have anything pending yet, so feel free to go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, I did just get one here.
All right.
That might be related. Yeah. What? Okay, let me see this. Oh, so do you know this? What percentage of the current offsets being used in California were from out of state? Do you have any sense of that?
That's a fun fact. I don't know. What I can say is that most of the offsets that are being used now are California is not the major percentage supplier of the offsets. And I'll show you, actually coming up in the next couple of slides, I'll show you why. So good question.
Here, I did get another one pop up. It said pop up here. It says, will you address the cost of verification for projects entering in the offset pool, and who pays for the cost of verification?
Yeah, sure will. I hit that later on in the mechanics, so we definitely will cover that.
Okay, great.
So to this first question, that's a good that first question is a good segue into this next section. So landowners in the lower 48, there's a whole series of policy decisions that California had to make when they did cap and trade. I mean, first of all, they didn't have to allow offsets to be a part of that at all. They could have said, hey, all of these emitters, you have to buy allowances. Offsets have no place in this. But they wanted to spur innovation and cost reduction in their program. They realized the associated benefits of allowing offsets, so they allowed offsets. But again, they really constrained the use. They also had to make a decision about where those offsets came from. Getting to this question about where are most of these offsets coming from. So they decided that all landowners in the lower 48, and then in 2015 they brought in coastal Alaska, could participate in the California compliance market. Just to note, this is California WCI, that's the Western Climate Initiative. Quebec is actually linked up to the California market, but they're not really a supplier into the market. They actually have demand. So I'll leave that alone, but I wanted to put a nod there in case anybody was saying, hey, this is really the Western Climate Initiative market. Yes, it is, but California is 95% or plus of that market. So forest carbon projects in the California market are supplying about 85% of all of the offsets. There are 5 offset project types. Remember, there's there are several different types of greenhouse gases, of which carbon dioxide is just one. And forest carbon offset projects obviously are addressing the carbon dioxide equation, but there's ozone depleting substances, there's ag methane, and rice methane, and urban forestry. And sorry, I'm drawing a bit of a blank, but by far, forest carbon offsets are the major supplier of carbon offset projects to the California program, with ODS, or ozone depleting substances, being second. Now, this gets into more of the mechanics of or performance ranges for lands across the United States. And what you'll see, the punchline here is that fundamentally a carbon offset is a forest product. So anything that influences the productive capacity and output of a forest, for a conventional forest product, for saw timber, for pulpwood, for whatever, is going to have a similar influence on the productivity of a forest and a landowner's parcel for carbon offsets. And so you see, the land of milk and honey in California, the Pacific Northwest, where you can grow a big tree in a short period of time, that you can have very large day one payments of upwards of $800 to $1,200 per acre in that first year. After that first year, again, we'll unpack the mechanics of how the carbon project works, but after the first year, at least for a California carbon offset, you move into more of what is happening with your net annual growth. So the first year in a California project, it's a measure or a look, it's a comparison of a landowner's on-site carbon stocks versus a regional average stocking level, which is derived from the U.S. Forest Service's FIA analysis. And we'll go into that in more detail in a bit. Thereafter, it's a question of what is the landowner doing with their annual growth? How much of their annual growth are they harvesting? How much has been, how much mortality has occurred against growth? What we see is that most landowners, even very active, intensively managed forest lands, are not harvesting 100% of their growth. They're somewhere between 0 and 100. So depending on their annual harvesting and what kind of mortality they have, they may be generating a couple of tons per acre per year. So that's why you see a very large upfront payment, because most of the landowners, all of the landowners that are participating in the California program, their stocking, for whatever reason, is much higher than the surrounding region, and that regional stocking average. And then depending on their harvest regime, they're accumulating more growth in their forest over time. So this is how it falls out. And just to show how this translates into actual projects. So Native American communities, and again, this gets back to that question about, where most of the tons coming from. Not only are they coming from outside of California, although California does have a lot of projects, but the big projects are coming from Indian country, from Native American communities. And this shows, this is average. The numbers that you see here for carbon value and revenue is based on a 10% offset price, which is the average between when the program started in 2013 to current. But you can see that these projects are quite large in terms of acreage, and because most tribes manage their forests pretty conservatively, their management is very well aligned with what California likes to see in terms of their rules for carbon projects. So they just tend to generate. But if you look at that last column, the dollars per acre, it's within that range that you saw in the previous slide of between $200 and $800 or $900 per acre for the first year carbon offset value. So that's the sort of range that we see. And these are, I think this represents all of the Native American projects that have been registered to date, but there's quite a few more that are in the works, including our own. Now, something that might be, here's the environmental NGOs, and again, just another demographic to show you, a number of projects that have participated. What's interesting here is the diversity in terms of geography, region, which obviously translates into forest types, and the size, and therefore the performance of these projects. Again, if you look at the right-hand column, you'll see that those performance ranges on a per acre basis are within that $200 to $900 per acre first year. But there's a lot more diversity here in terms of size. So one of the questions that we often get is, what's the minimum size for performance? Well, that really is going to vary. And this gets into that second question that was asked about the costs of verification. The big costs of developing a carbon offset project are really threefold. The one is the inventory. These are very intense, very detailed inventories that have to be done, because you're not just taking a snapshot of volume in time, but that volume has to be maintained and reviewed, reported and verified and monitored for 100 years. So the cost of installing a carbon plot is what we see is anywhere between $250 to $350 plus in the lower 48. And if when you get into developing carbon projects in coastal Alaska, you can triple or quadruple that. So really expensive, and that's a problem. That's obviously a big barrier to entry to landowners. And then verification costs have gone up as well, unfortunately, for various reasons that we'll get into in a moment. But even on the smallest verifications now, we're seeing costs of $40,000 per verification, which have to occur every 6 years. When you forecast these costs out 100 years and then discount them back, at a reasonable rate of, interest rate, even the smallest landowners have to set aside $300,000 to $400,000 day one for their long-term operations and maintenance costs. And that's, that's regardless of the size of the project. And so size is your friend. It makes sense, given what the costs are to develop a project, that the bigger the better. So some of the smaller projects that you see here really were on the bubble. And did it make sense financially for them to do that? Every landowner is going to be different. I think most landowners, what we see, it's not a matter of how many acres, it's really about the initial performance in the compliance program. It usually takes about $500,000 or about, anyway, it's going to vary a lot by landowner, but if you've got $500,000 in costs, most landowners are going to want to see, at least $1 million return day one net to make it work. And what that translates into is needing at least, a 300,000 ton project initially to make work. So, you can compare that against what we've seen on this project performance chart. Now, to date, about 140 million California compliance offsets have been issued. There's about 17 million that are pending issuance. They're in final regulatory review, and about 20 million that are in verification. Why is that? Why are those numbers important? Well, the total demand for this first program period for California, we estimated somewhere between 180 and 200 million offsets. Now, there's a portion of that 140 million that have been issued that for forest offset projects are in a special buffer. It's basically an insurance mechanism. But my point here of flashing that up is that the supply is starting to approach demand for this first program period that runs through 2020, and that has some important, implications for landowners that are thinking about getting involved with this program. And again, we'll revisit that in a moment. So, just to show, this is our project map, but again, just to show it's pretty representative, given that finite carbon is 50% of the forest offset market and about 40% of the total market. This is pretty good. It gives you a pretty good sense of who is involved in doing a project. Land trusts and nonprofits, TMOs and REITs. We already mentioned the Alaska Native corporations and tribes, some corporate family ownerships. Everywhere that there's forest land and every type of forest land, and most states that have forest land have now done a project, which should give landowners some comfort that they're not at the bleeding edge of this. It's still a big decision for landowners to get involved and to do the due diligence and figure out if they're going to do a carbon project. But all of the first ofs have been done in terms of all of the variables that we just mentioned. So this gives you a pretty good idea of who's doing projects and where. Again, they're generating a significant revenue for landowners. It really is unfortunately a bit of a niche opportunity because of the cost of developing and maintaining a project. But for landowners that do these projects, it's a significant source of revenue for maintaining the types of conservative, sustainable forest management that they've been practicing that got them into a high stocking scenario or a profile to begin with. So just a note on time, we've got 35 projects, but about 3 million acres enrolled, and then with you look at other developers, they combine, they have about another 3 million acres. So this isn't new now. This is happening at scale. There's about 6 million acres that either have been developed or underdeveloped of U.S. forest lands. So that's pretty significant. So why are landowners considering doing carbon offset projects? Well, it's pretty straightforward, but stewardship. It's a new cash flow on conservatively managed working forests. Managing forest lands is not a trivial pursuit, and anytime you can generate new revenue that's in line with landowners' sustainable forest management goals, that's a good thing. So it's a great thing that these carbon markets have come up to pay for the cost of roads and infrastructure and forest management. but it's also becoming an important source of conservation capital. You know, we have many landowners now that have used forest carbon to help close the gap between buyer and seller on the asking price, and to generate revenues for purchasing new forest lands for portfolios. And that's especially true in the TMO space. But it's also been done in the private space. So as a matter of fact, our company actually purchased land in Northern California based on the carbon value. Of course, you've got to have a very, very good insight into how a property will perform under a carbon project if you're counting and relying on carbon revenue to be a component of the value that's going to cover the purchase of a property. So this gets really into the nuts and bolts of how a carbon project performs. I've already talked through a lot of this, but I think it helps to see it graphically. So how a carbon project performs in California. Now, underlying all of this is this concept of additionality. And that's really, what carbon volume can be counted and attributed to a landowner's actions that's above some baseline or business as usual practice. And just before I start throwing curves on this graph, I just want to point out that there are different approaches or theories to additionality, and none of them are right or wrong, but they are pretty different. And even, you take one piece of land and run it through an offset project for California, it may and probably will perform very differently if you were to develop that same project under, say, the American Carbon Registry or the Voluntary Carbon Reserve. That's because of the offset protocol's approach to additionality and how a landowner's stocking compares to that baseline. So we're showing this for California, and you can see that this is on-site carbon stocks over time. The first thing that we do is we figure out what is the reference point. What is the landowner's stocks going to be compared to? Again, for California, this is based on a series of stocking averages or metrics that were developed from the Forest Service's FIA data set. Yay, U.S. Forest Service FIA data set, because if that didn't exist, it's fair to say that the forest carbon program for California wouldn't be functional. I mean, there has to be that there, and that also explains why in some parts of the world there isn't an offset program, because they simply don't have good regional or jurisdictional data to be able to compare and develop these baselines. So this is based on the FIA data set. These are all these are private plots or plots on private lands that have been aggregated by supersection, or basically Bailey's ecoregions, and then by major forest type, and sometimes further divided by high and low site class. So any statisticians that are on the line can, are probably automatically thinking, wow, you're really dividing that data up a lot. How sticky is it? And the answer is it starts to fall apart. I mean, they're really pushing their approach to this as far as they can. So sometimes you'll see these stocking averages be high or low relative to what somebody's thinking or experience is in the woods, but nevertheless it is what it is. So it's a common practice approach. The next thing that we do is we look at a landowner's on-site stocks, and so in year 0 you see that blue dot and you're comparing that to that red dot, and the initial offsets is that delta. It's how far is that landowner above that regional average. Then we look at what's happening, what is a landowner doing with their annual growth. And so there are kind of 3 broad scenarios. One would be that the first that harvest is equal to 100% of the annual biological growth, and in that case, then there wouldn't be any offsets. Secondarily, if you're retaining some growth but you're harvesting some of it, then you're going to get only the portion that you're retaining. And then, sorry, I had the first one and the last one reversed, but you get the idea. The last one is if landowners are harvesting 100% of their growth, they wouldn't have any annual offsets. So back to the first one, if they're retaining 100% of their growth and they get to account or or assert that 100% of that growth in their forest is there, and then they're able to monetize that growth as annual offsets. And that, rinse, lather, repeat, you're doing that every year. So every year a landowner wants to sell offsets. They're submitting an annual report that asserts a certain amount of stocking in their forest to the regulator. And if there's growth and there's an annual increase, then they can request issuance for that number of offsets that's equivalent to their growth. So that's how it all fits together, at least in California. Where are we finding this growth on a landowner's property? Well, first, it's simply an untapped asset class. So there's a lot of carbon in a forest that isn't going to make it to a conventional forest product, but that we can count as carbon, because it is carbon that's being retained on site. And that would include rotten, cull, sound defect trees, non-merchantable species, including non-merchantable species and non-commercial trees that are less than 10 or 6 inches in diameter, below ground, coarse roots, not carbon that's just included in the soil. The California ARB decided not to include that as an allowable pool. That is allowed in some voluntary carbon offset standards. Second is simply special lands, gains on lightly or unmanaged stands and tracts. There's all sorts of reasons why landowners, walk away from managing forest lands that legally they could. And if those actions are voluntary, if they're not required in an easement or by some state or federal regulation, then they can count that volume in those special lands as carbon offsets. And then once a project is done and has been monetized, then it becomes sort of an annual optimization issue. You're looking at, how much growth do you have in carbon, and how, what is the price of a carbon offset relative to what would that tonnage in carbon bring on the market for a conventional wood product. And there are places in the U.S. now, for a host of reasons, why carbon offsets are now competitive on a ton-for-ton basis with conventional forest products, especially pulpwood. Maine is one of those places. So it's interesting to see, we talk about carbon often as sort of an unconventional forest product, but, now that we've got 6 million acres in, and, we've got 170 projects that are listed, it's becoming more conventional. More and more landowners are thinking about this, and they're looking at carbon, retained in their forest, and what kind of value that brings on a ton-for-ton basis or acre basis relative to conventional forest products. And every project is a unique mix of these strategies. So landowner commitments, there are 4 kind of broad categories for California. The big one is that golden rule is that you may not harvest more than growth. The other way of saying that is you have to at least maintain the carbon stocks at which point you entered the program, and flatline those. If you grow your carbon stocks more, that's great, but you don't have to. The other big issue, and really this is one that's a barrier to entry in addition to cost, is California's definition of even-aged harvest, which is anything that's 40 acres or above and less than 50 square feet of basal area residual. Is counted even-age harvest, and that's verboten. You may not do that. So that simply doesn't make sense for some forest systems, and that's why you won't see loblolly pine plantations in the South being registered or developed as forest carbon projects, because that's not the way they're managed. If there's commercial harvesting, then there's a sustainable forest management requirement of either one of the participation in one of the 3 major certification programs, or a state or federally approved plan through like the Forest Stewardship Program. The big costs of developing and maintaining a project really come down to the MRV the monitoring, reporting, verification requirements. That would be the audits. Desk reviews, field verifications required every 6 years, A verification of your project is required every year that you want offsets issued, but you have to do a desk audit and a field audit at least once every 6th year in California. And also you have to re-inventory your forests according to the regulation or the protocol every 12 years. But the reality of this, because of the verification requirement, the statistical requirement of using sequential sampling, is that you can't go into a mandatory 6-year verification with a grown or modeled inventory. So what that means is that instead of every 12 years of having to re-inventory your forest, it's really every 6 years. Obviously, that translates into more costs. And then some sort of endowment that we strongly encourage landowners to put aside to maintain and operate their project. So when we talk about 100 years for a project, what we're talking about is that for 100 years after the last year that an offset has been issued to a project, they have to maintain and operate their project, which means that they have to submit an annual offset project data report, and they have to go through the auditing and re-inventory requirements on a 6-year cycle for that 100 years. So that's what the big landowner commitments are. The project development cycle, we used to say 12 months, but that is not true anymore. It's at least, an 18-month project development process. It starts off with, what we're doing right now, feasibility, education, basically, letting the landowner, helping them do their due diligence to make an informed decision. The end point of that is doing some sort of appraisal of project performance using a landowner's existing inventory, GIS, forest management plan, easement if there is one, to see how a project would theoretically perform. At that point, we list the project, which means that that's a public notification document that goes out, and it says it's basically like getting a building permit. It says the who, what, where, when, and why of what's going to be done. At that point, we inventory the project. We take that inventory and we do the modeling and documentation. All of that is verified both in the field, the inventory, and at the desktop for all of our documentation. Once the project's verified, it goes to the regulator, unfortunately, basically for another verification. It used to be early on just sort of a review. Now it's really a full audit. Every project has to go through, and that's really the reason why these projects have extended from 12 months out to 18 months plus, is the time that it takes in regulatory review to get these projects through. And once a project is reviewed and approved, then it's called registered. And at that point, when a project is registered, the offsets are issued to the landowner's offset account, and they're transacted, and then ongoing support after that period. So I think part of the other question that was asked here was, who incurs the costs? Again, the big cost being inventory and verification. It depends. There's a lot of different kinds of deal structures here. On these very large projects that we see, especially in Indian country, and what we try to do, at least our firm, is to put together a structure where there's no out-of-pocket cost for the landowner, and some combination of the developer and or the buyer, who ultimately these offsets are going to, will cover the upfront costs, and then those costs may or may not be backed out once the project is initially registered. Obviously, the developer is getting some percentage of the value of those offsets, either being paid directly in offsets in the commodity or in dollars, or some combination of the two. Then when you get into once the project is registered, usually the landowner takes over all the long-term operations and maintenance costs. And again, unfortunately, the development operations and maintenance costs and complexity are increasing. That's kind of stating the obvious, but just to bring that home. So just to wrap this up on the outlook side, for the compliance market outlook, again, some of this we've said, but so we're right now nearing the end of the first program period for California, which started in 2013, goes through 2020. We're seeing supply starting to bump up against what we think that the total first program period demand is going to be, which is around 180 million tons. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that if a landowner today is starting to consider doing a project, they're really not selling, but by the time they do their due diligence, consider doing a project, develop that project and register it, they're really not selling into this program period market. They're selling into the program period 2. And recall that in that second bullet point that while the program has been extended out to 2030, the amount of offsets has been reduced from 8% to 4/6%, and half of those offsets have to have direct environmental benefits to the state of California, and we don't know exactly what that means. So, it's tough. If you're in the state of California, or hopefully the Colorado and Columbia River watersheds, you've got a high level of confidence that you're going to be selling into that DEBS market, which probably is going to be short. There just aren't that many projects that can be developed, and so that's a good situation to be in. If you're outside of that DEBS market, like in the eastern U.S., it's a whole nother calculation, because you've already got a lot of projects that are in there that are spinning off annual tons, and it's going to be a more competitive situation to find a buyer. And in that way, that non-DEBS market may turn out to look a bit more like the voluntary market, where you really want to make sure that you have a buyer lined up before you start that project. And then there's the big question mark of linked jurisdictions to the California market. Quebec is in right now, and over the next 10-year period, they may demand about 20 million tons, which is great. Every bit counts. Ontario was in, but when they elected Doug Ford in 2017, the very first thing that Doug Ford did was he removed Ontario, which would have been about 60 or 70 million tons of demand linked up with this California program, ended that program. So immediately that potential demand went away. Might they come back in? Yeah, it's possible, but doubtful in the near future. So if you look at that third bullet, that's what we're looking at for total 21 to 2030 demand, about 170 million tons. Again, very similar to what we had for this first program period, but it's over a period of 10 years as opposed to 7. And you've got that DEBS, non-DEBS kind of bugaboo hanging out there. Also, and hello, Edie, I saw that you were joining the call today. Oregon, in their 2019 legislative session, is now considering doing cap and trade, which may include forest carbon offsets in it, and it may link up to California and the WCI program. So that's pretty exciting. It wouldn't add a lot of potential demand, but again, every bit counts. And it also is more of a proof of concept, as we see more jurisdictions put a price on carbon and link up to California, WCI, Quebec. Others may follow suit. So that's pretty important. We'll certainly be watching what's happening and trying to influence what's happening in Oregon this year. In the voluntary market, there's some interesting things to watch. But again, more known unknowns than we'd like to be able to actually develop projects to. The first one is the International Civil Aviation Organization and their carbon offset reduction scheme for international aviation. This is notable because it's the first sector globally that is voluntarily capping their emissions. Unfortunately, right now, we don't know, what kinds of offset project types are going to be allowed, what protocols, anything that we would need to know to develop offsets into that program. The way that's going to work is that emissions are going to be capped from the international aviation sector is going to go carbon neutral from 2020 levels. But the first part of their program, 2021 through 2026, is voluntary participation. Everybody that's involved has to report their emissions, but they don't have to offset those emissions, or their participation to offset their emissions is voluntary out until 2026. That's a long time to develop offset projects too. So it's going to be very interesting to see who decides to participate and actually reduce their emissions through the use of offsets for this first 5 years. And also notable is that the other global sectors may be following suit, like international shipping. industry. And Maersk during Poland made pretty interesting determination or announcement that they were going to eliminate their emissions from their fleet. And I forget whether that was by 2035 or 2050, but the point was it was pretty significant announcement. Others are following suit. And then RGGI, which is the 9 states in New England. Now 6 or 7 of those states have adopted the legislation within their states to extend the RGGI program beyond 2020. I think New York, Connecticut, and New Hampshire are the 3 that haven't yet. New York obviously is the big one there. And also notable is that Pennsylvania, just in the last week, Governor Wolf has made overtures that Pennsylvania may join RGGI or put some sort of price on carbon emissions. And again, that's very significant because Pennsylvania is the 3rd largest emitter by state in the United States. We're a long way from knowing if that's actually going to happen, but it's always nice to see, announcements made that folks are working on these sorts of things. So, thank you for that. That was a lot of information coming at you in a short period of time, but I really hope that both in terms of the who's doing these projects, the mechanics of it, and the policy, both past and where we may be heading, can help you to as you're seeing news articles and different things happening in your state and nationally, kind of make sense of this of what's happening in the carbon offset space. So.
Thank you. Dylan, thank you so much. This was a really wonderful presentation. I will say that we have some really great questions here, and we're definitely not going to get to all of them. So for those of you that have submitted questions and you're going to want to see a response, we'll be finishing that up in a Word document and posting it with the materials. I did just get a question of a copy of this presentation, and we do post, this is recorded, and we will post a link to the presentation, and we'll also post any unanswered questions in a Word document that we'll have Dylan respond to, and post that alongside with the presentation and a PDF of this presentation as well. But since we do have a few moments, why don't I get at a couple of questions here. We have some kind of like nuts and bolts questions that maybe I'll start with. One was about harvested wood products and how they're handled in a crediting process. And one was like, if there is 100% harvest, is it possible to still get credits for harvested wood products?
Yeah, so it's the short answer is yes, absolutely. Harvested wood products are included in the calculation, but there's what's called primary and secondary effects. So the long answer gets long and complicated, but basically long-lived wood products you certainly get credit for. The wood that you can demonstrate that's going into forest products that's not going to go into a landfill anytime soon, you're going to get credit for that. It's usually a very small percentage of the amount of the overall performance of a project in California for a California offset project. So, but yeah, it's very much included in the calculation for an offset project.
Okay, and then another quick question here is, can you speak to aggregation of smaller landholders into projects, and if you're seeing that, I mean, with the understanding that costs are a big barrier, and particularly limiting for smaller landowners, are you seeing smaller projects or smaller landholders coming together to create larger projects?
Yeah, so again, it's one of these things where the short answer is sort of, the long answer is, a lot more complicated, but it's a theoretical opportunity. Notable is that Finite has developed the first aggregated project for the California Compliance Program, and it's with the Lakes Region Conservation Trust in New Hampshire and a private landowner. And so that project is in final regulatory review, and we, fingers crossed that that project will be registered here in the first quarter of 2019. That's only 2 landowners, but it gets very complicated, at least in the California in the compliance space, because you have to have some sort of legal mechanism that keeps these landowners together for the 100-year MRV period. If one landowner were to leave, then the entire project falls apart, and that's considered a voluntary termination, and just bad things happen financially to the folks that were involved. So we worked with the Lakes Region Conservation Trust and this private family landowner. It's about 10,000 acres total. The private landowner is 1,500 acres. The land trust brought in about 8,500 acres. They are tied together through the Carbon Project. They also, the land trust now holds a conservation easement that was just consummated at the end of 2018. And they are putting in place a separate carbon operating agreement, which we've helped to craft, and which was partially underwritten by the Land Trust Alliance through a partnership that we're involved with Doris Duke, their climate initiative, and that language for that operating agreement, will redact the specifics out of that project, and that'll be available through the Land Trust Alliance later this year.
Okay.
Now, in the voluntary space, there are lower barriers to aggregation, and you'll see, there's a much more higher incidence of landowners doing aggregated projects. But that's because the MRV requirements don't have the same kind of impose the same sort of barriers and constraints on landowners to doing these aggregated projects. But also we have to hit a certain statistical, well, again, it gets complicated quick, but I'll say that as soon as you start to peel back the onion on doing an aggregated project, you talk about potentially being able to distribute costs around, but you also have to have the accounting mechanisms in place to make sure who's contributing how much carbon to the project. That translates into needing a certain amount of plots on the individual landowners that are involved with the project, and also to be able to equitably distribute the gains or the performance from the carbon project to the individual participants. So it's complicated.
No, that's still very useful context. So thank you for that. And I do have some really wonderful questions here, but we typically don't go over too long. So I think that instead of trying to choose one, I will just strongly encourage everyone, probably more so than normal, to be sure to check out the responses afterwards, and we can send them out. Perhaps do something a little different, and we'll send this kind of PDF of the responses to these outstanding questions to everyone that registered for the webinar, to make sure that you have a chance to see them, because we do have some really great questions in here. And so with that, I'll just kind of begin to wrap up. But again, we have recorded your questions, and we are going to get responses to them. So I wanted, of course, thank our guest Dylan today for a really great presentation. Let me take the screen back here as well. And of course, to our Forest Climate Working Group and the steering committee, who's been really instrumental in providing guidance and leadership on the series, and to everyone that joined us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and your attention, and we hope that you found this presentation useful and helpful. I know I sure did. So thanks again to everyone, and we'll be in touch soon. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks so much, Dylan.
You bet. Thank you.